Aloha and welcome to the screencast where I'm going to go over the code that manipulates or implements forms for adding things and editing things in this template application. I want to note that I have a whole separate sample application called meteor-application-template-react that where I go into form processing in more detail, and I also have kind of a little bit more complicated form stuff. So to really get a detailed sense of how forms work, you want to look at that sample application as well. But because we're here right now, I wanted to spend at least a few minutes talking about form processing. So let's go to this page, add stuff, and what you can see is we've got this form. I can click submit, and I get some errors because stuff should be defined. And then so I could say mangoes, and there's 5 of them, and they're in excellent condition. And if I click submit, I get this thing called a suite alert, which is an NPM package for doing alert processing. And I say OK. And then if I go to the list stuff page, you can see, great, now I have mangoes listed. And then I can go to the edit page where it's pre-filled with the current value, and I can decide that my mango tree really kicked it out, so now there's 55. And if I click that, say OK, and I go to list stuff, now you can see that that's been updated to 55 mangoes. So that's basically how form processing works. We have 2 pages, an add stuff page and an edit stuff page. And so let's look at the code that implements that and talk a little bit about how that works. Starting off with the add stuff page. Actually, before we go there, I should say that what we're using to implement this is a package called uniforms, which is a set of React libraries for building forms. And the notion is, in fact, I have an example of this. If you have like the sign up page, in this example template, that's implemented using kind of old school React form processing. If you do the React tutorials, you'll see they'll get to some point where they say, how do you do form processing in React? And you'll see something like this that has some like a handle change method. So whenever any form control changes, the user interacts with it, you're going to call this, and you have to figure out you have this state variable that updates this local state field called state, or our local field state object, which is bound to an object which has fields for each of the controllers in your form, at least one field for each controller in your form. And then every time you have this handle change method, which is going to have to update that object via the set state call. And then finally, when you get to handle submit, you're going to go, get the final state object, and figure out what the values are that you need from it, and go ahead and do whatever you're going to do. And then inside your render method, you've just got, in this case, this is semantic UI React forms, but there, you got a form object, and you've got an input object, and it's kind of the bare HTML form stuff with some React stuff around it. So what the uniforms folks realized is that there's a couple things you could abstract out. The first thing you could abstract out is this idea of having to build up monitor the controllers and build up an object that corresponds to the values of those controllers, and then also what you don't see here, but which is very important, which is the whole validation part. Like, are people entering valid values into these objects? So that's one thing that the uniforms folks realize. We could simplify things, because you're always kind of going to have to implement that, and that doesn't need to change for various forms. It's a standard kind of thing. Let's implement one standard way and put it into the library, so we can get rid of some code for the client, for the user, from that perspective. The second thing is realizing that there's a lot of, for semantic UI, you want the forms to be laid out using certain kind of primitives. For Bootstrap, you need others, and for Ant, you need others. So why don't we just build some specialized subpackage which kind of customize our boilerplate code for handling the controllers for a particular CSS theme or CSS library. So the result is this thing called uniforms. It's very popular for React. And if you kind of go to the playground, what you can see is it gives you examples of, oh, and then the third thing they said is, well, how do you tell our library what are the set of controllers, and you know, what is the data that you actually want to be extracting from the user via this form, and how do you specify that? And so the convenient way to do that is some kind of schema declaration. Okay, and so so it turns out they have a few different schema packages in NPM, and Uniform supports a bunch of different schema packages, including the ones that we use in Meteor, Simple Schema. And then in terms of the different kinds of CSS frameworks, they support a bunch, including the one that we use, which is Semantic UI. And so as a result, you have this ability to write less code that will be more correct, have less bugs in it when you're implementing forms and need validation and so forth. That's the good side. The bad side is that you got to kind of understand how the uniforms library works. It's not hard to understand, and I'm hoping that with this example plus the Meteor example form React sample system that I gave you, you'll be well on your way to seeing the way that you do it. And once you start doing it, you know, most cases you probably won't want to go back to doing it the kind of the vanilla way. All right. So let's actually, you know, with that whole parentheses aside, or you know, digression. It was a digression into another way to do form processing, but the form processing that you actually want to do is illustrated here. And what you can see in a nutshell is that, let's just, you know, get this back into your brain again. Okay, we want to do an add stuff. So we got this page where we've got this form consisting of 3 values: a name, a quantity. A name is text, quantity is a number, condition is a, you know, selection, and we press submit and we're going to add things. So how do we actually implement that? So we have a grid. This is Semantic UI. We have a single column, that's Semantic UI. We have a header, Semantic UI. Then we have this auto form thing, which is uniforms. And what we're going to say is we're going to pass into it a schema that we define right up here. And this is a simple schema that says, hey, in this schema we're looking for 3 kinds of data: a string name, a numeric quantity, and a condition, which is all the elements are going to be type string. Here are the allowed values, and here's the default value. Okay, so a very declarative way of specifying the data that we want to get from this form, and we pass it in to this auto form thing. And then what we say is, because we want a little bit of custom formatting, we can embed within this auto form thing a kind of a mixture of Semantic UI stuff with, like, segment. Okay, you can see we get segment from Semantic UI React, as well as things like text field, which come from the Semantic UI custom version, or, you know, Semantic UI version of the text field controller. Okay, so we're going to say we're going to have this segment, which just draws the little line around things, and then we'll have a text field, and the name of that text field is name, and that's the way Semantic UI is going to connect this field to this schema element, right? So you can see for each name, quantity, condition in our schema, we have a name, quantity, and condition in our form, and that's how it figures out what schema is to be bound or associated with each controller. And then the cool thing is, you can see it takes this condition, it figures out, oh, this is the condition field. Oh, look, here are the allowed values. Here's the default value. I'm going to make myself a select field, a pull-down menu. It's going to default to good, and it's going to have these other kinds of values. Okay, so it's pretty nice that way. And then we're going to specify that any errors occur when someone presses submit are going to go down in this errors field. And here's the cool thing. Another cool thing of uniforms is that when I press submit, you know, and there's nothing there, I get these validation errors, but I never even got to, even though I pressed the submit button, I didn't invoke this code. So the submit function only gets invoked once the validation stuff is passed within, within the form is satisfied. So another, kind of nice thing that Uniforms provides for you for free. Okay, so that's the schema, and then on submit, we're going to say what's going to happen is on submit, you supply a function, okay, and this is the function that I'm supplying. It's a function that takes one argument called data, and whose body is an invocation of the submit function up here, passing it the data and this fref. I'll get to that in a couple seconds. But for now, just think that the idea is you're going to pass to AutoForm a function which it will call when the submit button is pressed and there are no validation errors, that function will be invoked with an object where each of the fields in your schema are going to be bound to the values that were in the controllers at the time that it successfully passed validation. So then we call this submit function with that object, and our first line deconstructs that object into a set of variables corresponding to the fields. We have 3 fields, you can see from this form schema. We also, to do this insert into the stuffs collection, we need to know the owner of the data, which is the person's username, so we get that, and then we do the stuff.insert, and then we include a callback with the insert, which is a function that is passed an error object in the event there is an error. And so if there is an error, it's going to say, things messed up, and here's the problem. Otherwise, it's going to have a little sweet alert. That's what that swall thing means. Sweet alert saying, yeah, everything is cool. And then following that, we want to reset the form. So there is this little bit of complication. So you can notice, like I put Philip Johnson, or no, wait, this is add stuff. So what should I add? I'll add cucumbers. And I only have 2 cucumbers, and they're kind of in fair condition. Okay, so I do submit. It says OK. And now you can notice that the data went away, right? Which is the standard thing you want to do when you're adding an element. You want the form to be cleared once it's successfully submitted. And so how do we do that? Well, what we need to do is we need to get a reference to the form object, okay, and call the reset method on it. And so the question is, well, how do I get it? Like this AutoForm guy normally is managing the form, and now way up here in the submit method, I need to somehow have a reference to that actual internal form object to call reset on it. But AutoForm is normally, kind of hiding that form reference from us. All right. So how do we get external access to that variable to a variable that will be bound to that form instance, so that I can call reset it in the submit method? And this is the standard way you do it. It turns out that AutoForm has this ref property where you bind it to a function which will be called with the form reference object. And all this little function is going to do is bind this local variable fref to being that form reference. And the reason why we do that is so that later in our onSubmit method, we can now say the onSubmit method is passed a function that will be called with data, and then called this submit with that data that's passed plus the fref reference, right, which is lexically scoped. So it will, at the time this is called, will be bound to that that reference object. Okay, and so once we're in there, we've now got this reference to the form, and we can just call this reset thing. So all that kind of, those shenanigans are necessary just to make sure that you can reset your form to the default state after you successfully add an item. All right, that is the add method, and then the other form. So we go to list stuff, we got our cucumbers, we want to get this edit method. Okay, so the thing that's interesting here is you can see we're editing a pre-existing stuff item, and the way that we did that was we invoked a page which had the path edit followed by a doc ID, a valid doc ID that point in this stuff's collection. And we're going to use the URL in order to figure out what do we populate this form with. So let's see how we do that. If we go to edit stuff, the first thing you'll see is that we're going to use our with tracker method, which is our method that Meteor supplies in order to create components that are reactive and that have access to data from the database. Okay, and in this case it's even a little more complicated because we're going to use this optional object to get the URL that's invoked when we are when we're trying to render this component. Which reminds me, maybe what I should start off by doing is showing you that the edit page looks like this in our router, and that creates a path which has this like variable in it, okay, which says we're going to render the edit stuff component or the edit stuff page in the event that there is a user that's logged in, okay, and the path is going to look like this, where we have a doc ID, and so if we go to edit stuff, back to edit stuff, okay, what you can see is we'll extract just that piece of the URL, the one containing the doc ID. And then what we're going to do is we're going to subscribe to the data in the stuff collection that's owned by this user. And the reason why I can say that with authority is because if you look at the stuff publication, you can see that it's publishing only the data associated with the currently logged in user. Okay, so what that means is, and then what happens, okay, is that we will set the property, the prop types, with a doc that consists of finding the document object associated with the doc ID that we found from the URL, and we're going to use this subscription.ready to make sure that we render the page once only we render this page once the subscription has been received. If the subscription is not ready yet, we're going to render the semantic UI loading icon. So some of you might be wondering, well, what happens if I somehow knew the doc ID of somebody else's stuff and I just typed it in, okay? Would that work? And the answer is it wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to get that because this subscription guarantees that on the client side, only the items that you actually have created yourself are going to be the ones that this call will actually find. So things won't work out great if you type in some other doc ID, because basically this find one will return null, and then things could even blow up, and we probably should have some error checking to make sure that in the case where someone just tries to type something in, it goes to some like other page that says there's an error. But in this case, at least you're not going to be able to edit somebody else's stuff. It's just that the system won't. I'm not sure what will. Well, I don't know. You want to just find out? Let's just find out. So if we do that, okay. So we go to an edit stuff page and there's nothing in there. And I wonder what would happen if we actually try to update. Let's see what happens. Okay, so that's interesting. So there's no owner field, and so uniform says, you know what, I'm not even going to call the submit function because the owner field is not there. Huh. All right, so that works. That works a little better than I even thought it would. Okay, so at any rate, we get the document associated with the doc ID that was passed to us in the URL, and that becomes a property called doc. We also have this model property that the uniforms is going to add. And so then we're going to render this page, okay? And the way that we render this page, we have the schema, just like we had last time, but this time we're just going to use the schema from the stuffs collection, okay? So we can just reuse this exact same schema without any problem, because we've got all of the data in this field that's associated with that particular item. Okay, in the meteor example form React, I'm going to show you a more complicated situation where there isn't this one-to-one correspondence between the schema associated with a collection and the form that you're going to edit. Okay, but right here, it's kind of nice to just to see an example where there's this one-to-one, the schema that you use to define the collection is exactly what you want for specifying the form. So you can kind of reuse it. And then on submit, we have kind of the same standard thing. The thing that we have in addition in this case is this model parameter, which is bound to the doc object in the properties associated with this component. Okay, and remember that has been bound here to the document associated with this doc ID. So this is what uniforms is using to populate this form with its initial values. Okay, so then we lay out the text field. We'll find the name field from the doc ID and this element, and then we have a hidden field just so that just so that AutoForm knows what to do with all of the fields in the schema. All right, so this schema here, you can see we have this owner field, and it's required. So semantic UI, so uniforms wants to know, what do I do with that? And the simplest thing to say is, well, fine, just, we don't want to see it, but make a field where you put that owner thing in there. And it is the current owner, so it's like even if you somehow went into DevTools and, I don't know, it's going to be fine. And so we have text field name, quantity, condition, and the submit button. Any errors occur down here. And so you can see if we go to list stuff and we edit, we've retrieved this element from the database using the doc ID. We've extracted the fields and pre-populated the form, and now we can do things like, update our cucumbers to 22. We get this sweet alert, and now you can see we go to list stuff. Cucumbers is 22. So how did that work? Well, once the form passed the validation, we're going to call this dot submit with this data object, and the data object basically just extracts all of the different fields and then calls update in kind of the standard way and has this error. Okay, so that's basically it, the add stuff and the edit stuff. The one final thing that I will note is that in this template, as with all the different templates that I'm showing you, there's an important caveat, which is that we are using the insecure package. Okay, so this is something that Meteor provides, which makes life a lot simpler by saying that you have your server-side database, you have your mini Mongo database on the client, and you can, when you have insecure enabled, it's possible to simply call update and simply call insert on the actual mini Mongo collection, and those changes in mini Mongo will be replicated back to the server. Okay, that's what the insecure package does. It makes the code a little bit simpler, and for prototyping purposes, simpler code is better. All right. When you move a system developed like this into production, you have to replace these calls with things called meteor methods, which are basically remote procedure calls which say, okay, if you want to do an insert, we're going to do a remote procedure call to the server, try to do the insert over there, and then if that's successful, then the server contents will be replicated back to the client using the standard publication subscription approach. And so the code it's actually not really that much more code, but it's different code, and it would require me to teach you guys how to do meteor methods, and there's new syntax and stuff like that. And it didn't feel to me like it was a good value added when you have a short period of time to build a prototype to kind of explore user interface constructs and so forth. So in the code for these examples and in this class, I am recommending you just use the insecure package. That makes life a lot simpler in terms of database manipulation. It makes life a little more insecure with respect to database implementation, but that's okay when you're doing prototype development. And rest assured that before you move code like this into production, Meteor provides you with lots of elegant facilities to make your code secure. And it just take you a few days to learn how to do it and do the re-implementation. So it's not like you have to re-architect your code or anything. You're basically just changing these lines of code from a direct call to the mini Mongo client-side database to an RPC call to the server-side database, and then you'll be fine. Okay, that is form processing in Meteor Application Template React.